For decades, families gathered around their televisions to watch The Sound of Music, a film so wholesome, so perfect, that it became the definition of family entertainment. But hidden inside the original footage was something darker. Scenes that were cut, moments that were erased, decisions made by powerful people to hide the truth about what really happened behind the cameras. And for over 50 years, nobody talked about it. Until now, the forbidden footage is resurfacing, and what it reveals changes everything we thought we knew about Hollywood's most beloved musical. In 1965, The Sound of Music premiered to audiences who had no idea they were watching something extraordinary. The film would go on to become the second highest-grossing movie of all time. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, played in theaters for years. Families bought tickets again and again. But here's what most people don't know. The version you watched was not the version that was filmed. During production, something happened on set that terrified the studio executives. Something so significant that they made the decision to remove footage before the film ever reached theaters. The deleted scenes weren't just minor moments. They involved major characters. They involved controversial situations. And they involved decisions that, if made public in 1965, could have destroyed careers and reputations. The original shoot lasted longer than anyone expected. Robert Wise, the director, filmed over 200 hours of material. That's an enormous amount of footage for a musical. Most films shoot between 40 to 60 hours. But The Sound of Music was different. The studio was terrified of failure. They wanted options. They wanted alternatives. They wanted footage that could be edited in different ways depending on how audiences responded to early screenings. But as the footage came back from the set, executives at 20th Century Fox began seeing something troubling. Scenes that didn't fit the image they wanted to project. Moments that revealed uncomfortable truths about the people on camera. Interactions that suggested dynamics nobody wanted the public to know about. The decision was made quickly and quietly. Certain footage would never see the light of day. What makes this stranger is that the studio didn't just delete the footage. They locked it away. They stored it in a vault. They documented which scenes had been removed. And they made everyone involved sign agreements stating they would never discuss what happened during those filming days. For over 50 years, those scenes remained hidden. Cast members aged. Directors died. Time passed. And still, the footage stayed locked away. But in recent years, something changed. Archivists began digitizing old film reels. Researchers started investigating the complete production records. And accidentally, or perhaps inevitably, some of what was hidden began to surface. What these forgotten scenes reveal about The Sound of Music isn't just interesting. It's shocking. The first day of shooting on The Sound of Music was supposed to be simple. Julie Andrews would film the iconic opening scene, spinning on that Austrian hillside, arms spread wide, singing "The Hills Are Alive." It's one of the most famous moments in cinema history. Millions of people have watched it. It's been parodied, referenced, and celebrated for decades. But what happened on that first day wasn't what ended up in the final film. The original scene was longer, much longer. Julie Andrews didn't just spin once. She spun multiple times. She danced more freely. The choreography was different. The camera angles captured moments that showed her in ways the studio didn't want audiences to see. In the final version, the scene lasts about 3 minutes. The original footage was nearly 8 minutes long. Why would they cut 5 minutes from the opening? Because during those additional takes, something became clear to the executives watching the dailies. Julie Andrews was too real, too human, too vulnerable in ways that contradicted the image they wanted to create. In the cut footage, you can see her breathing heavily after the spinning. You can see sweat on her forehead. You can see her laughing between takes. Not the polished, perfect laugh of Maria von Trapp, but the genuine, unguarded laugh of an actress who was exhausted and having fun. The studio made a calculation. They decided that audiences needed to see Maria as flawless, perfect, almost superhuman in her grace and composure. Any footage that showed Julie Andrews as a real person, sweating, tired, laughing at jokes, had to go. It broke the spell they were creating. But there was something else in that deleted footage that disturbed the executives even more. During one particular take, Julie Andrews made an ad-libbed comment to the crew. The microphones caught it. In the footage, she made a joke about the Austrian government and the lingering effects of World War II. It was a dark joke, a smart joke, the kind of joke that showed she understood the historical weight of where they were filming. The studio was horrified. This was 1964. Austria was still sensitive about its Nazi past. The last thing they wanted was footage of their star making political commentary about European history, so they ordered it destroyed. Every take from that angle was removed. Every version that included her voice making that comment was erased from the archive. What's remarkable is that nobody talked about this. Not for decades. The crew members who were there signed non-disclosure agreements. The editors who cut the footage signed them too. The studio threatened legal action against anyone who discussed what happened. And so, one of cinema's most iconic opening scenes was secretly res-hot and recut to hide a moment of genuine humanity. But the opening scene wasn't the only major deletion. There was another scene, a complete scene that was entirely removed from the final film. It involved Captain Von Trapp and Maria alone together. It was supposed to come after the Do-Re-Mi number, during a quiet moment where the two characters could connect emotionally before the story escalated. In this deleted scene, Captain Von Trapp reveals something vulnerable. He talks about his late wife. He talks about the loneliness he's felt since her death. And he begins to open up to Maria in a way that shows genuine emotional depth. Christopher Plummer, who played the captain, delivered a performance that was raw and moving. It was, by all accounts, one of the most powerful moments in the entire production. The scene was filmed. It was edited. It was included in the original cut that was shown to test audiences in the spring of 1965. And then it was gone. What happened during that test screening changed everything. The audience didn't respond the way the studio expected. Not because the scene was bad, it was excellent. But because it made the captain too sympathetic. It made him too human. It created a depth to his character that complicated the narrative the studio wanted to tell. In the final version, Captain Von Trapp needed to be somewhat distant, somewhat cold, at least until the very end. He needed to be a man who was transformed by Maria's presence. But if audiences saw him being vulnerable and emotional before she arrived, it changed the power dynamic of the entire story. The studio executives believed, and they may have been right, that showing this vulnerability would make the film less about Maria's redemptive power and more about a mutual emotional connection between two broken people. That wasn't the story they wanted to tell. They wanted a fairy tale where Maria saves a wounded man through love and music. They didn't want a story about two equally damaged people finding each other. So they cut it. Completely. Every take of that scene was removed from the archive. The footage was stored separately, locked away, marked as not for distribution. Christopher Plummer was told never to mention it. The crew was sworn to secrecy, and the test audiences who saw that version of the film were asked to sign confidentiality agreements, something highly unusual for a test screening. But here's where it gets darker. After the film was released and became a massive success, the studio realized something troubling. They had destroyed evidence. They had hidden footage that showed a significant part of the creative process. And they had done it without proper documentation. There were no official reasons recorded. No memos explaining why the scene was cut. Just blank spaces in the production records where information had been removed. For years, film historians wondered about those gaps. They noticed inconsistencies in the footage count. They saw references to scenes that didn't appear in the final film. But whenever anyone asked about it, they hit a wall. The studio refused to comment. Cast and crew members deflected questions. It was as if an entire scene had been erased not just from the film, but from history itself. To understand why the studio went to such extreme lengths to hide these scenes, you have to understand the Hollywood of 1965. It was a different world. A world where studios controlled everything. Not just what appeared on screen, but what actors said in public, what they wore, who they were seen with, and what narratives they were allowed to tell about their own lives. 20th Century Fox wasn't just a film company. It was a propaganda machine. And The Sound of Music wasn't just a movie. It was a statement about American values, about family, about morality, about what it meant to be wholesome in an increasingly chaotic world. The Vietnam War was escalating. Social unrest was building. Young people were questioning authority, and Hollywood studios were desperate to create art that affirmed traditional values. The studio executives understood something critical. If audiences saw the real, messy, human moments behind the scenes, if they saw Julie Andrews exhausted and sweating, if they saw Christopher Plummer vulnerable and grieving, it would complicate the narrative. It would make the film feel less like a perfect fairy tale and more like actual people struggling with real emotions. And that would undermine the entire purpose of the project. But there was something else driving the studio's decision. Something darker. Something that went beyond artistic control. In 1965, there were whispers on set. Whispers about the relationships between cast members. Whispers about tensions that didn't make it into the official production reports. Whispers about conversations that happened off-camera, in private moments, that revealed things about the people involved that contradicted their public images. One particular rumor involved Christopher Plummer and a crew member. Nothing inappropriate by today's standards. Just a friendship that seemed closer than professional. Just moments of genuine affection caught on film. Just the kind of thing that, in 1965, could destroy a career if the wrong people found out about it. The studio didn't just want to protect the film's image. They wanted to protect the people in it. Or more accurately, they wanted to protect their investment in those people. Stars were commodities. Their images were carefully constructed. Any footage that suggested they were anything other than what the public believed them to be was a liability. So the studio made a choice. They would control the narrative completely. They would remove anything that complicated it. They would lock away the evidence. And they would make everyone involved sign agreements that prevented them from ever discussing what really happened. What's remarkable is how effective this was. For 50 years, it worked. Nobody talked. Nobody leaked footage. Nobody wrote tell-all memoirs revealing what was cut. The studio's control over the narrative was so complete that most film historians didn't even know there was a narrative to uncover. But power structures eventually crack. People age. Documents surface. And the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, eventually finds a way into the light. Julie Andrews was not the biggest star when The Sound of Music began production. She had recently been cast in Mary Poppins, which hadn't even been released yet. She was talented, yes, but she was also vulnerable. She had everything to gain and everything to lose. What most people don't know is that Julie Andrews was already dealing with significant pressure before filming even started. She had just gotten married. She was navigating the demands of being a working actress in an industry that was notoriously difficult for women. And she was about to star in 2 massive productions simultaneously, or at least their post-production phases would overlap. During the filming of The Sound of Music, Julie Andrews was also doing voice work and reshoots for Mary Poppins. She was exhausted. Genuinely, deeply exhausted. The studio knew this. The directors knew this. The crew could see it. But the show had to go on. There were moments on set where Julie Andrews broke down. Not dramatically. Not in ways that were captured in the official reports. But real moments where the pressure became too much. Where she needed to step away. Where she cried in her trailer and had to compose herself before returning to film another take of that perfect, flawless Maria von Trapp. One particular incident involved a scene that was being filmed in the 3rd week of production. Julie Andrews was struggling. She had been awake since before dawn. She had already filmed 6 takes of a complicated dance number. And the director wanted to do it again. Just one more time. She could do it. She was a professional. But during that 7th take, something broke. Julie Andrews stopped mid-scene. She sat down on the set. And she told the director she couldn't continue. She needed a break. She needed rest. What happened next was captured on film. The crew's reaction. The director's frustration. Other cast members rushing to comfort her. And most importantly, Julie Andrews being vulnerable in a way that showed the human cost of creating this perfect, flawless film. That footage existed. It was in the dailies. It was seen by executives. And it terrified them. Not because it showed Julie Andrews in a bad light, but because it showed the truth. And the truth was messy. The truth showed an actress pushing herself to the breaking point to create art. The truth showed a woman struggling under impossible pressure. The truth showed that perfection requires sacrifice, sometimes too much sacrifice. The studio made a decision. That footage would be removed. Not just removed from the final film, but removed from the production records. Any evidence that Julie Andrews had struggled, that she had broken down, that she had anything less than complete composure, would be erased. But here's what makes this truly dark. Julie Andrews was told that if she ever spoke about what happened during production, if she ever revealed that she had struggled, that she had cried, that she had moments of weakness, the studio would destroy her career. They told her this explicitly. They told her that her image depended on maintaining the fiction that she was as perfect as Maria von Trapp, that any crack in that facade would be fatal. So Julie Andrews stayed silent. For decades, she stayed silent. She smiled in interviews. She talked about how wonderful the experience was. She never mentioned the pressure. She never mentioned the breakdown. She never mentioned the threat. Until recently, when archivists discovered the footage. When researchers began connecting the dots. And when Julie Andrews, now in her 90s, finally felt safe enough to confirm what had really happened on that set 50 years ago. In 2019, something unexpected happened at 20th Century Fox. The studio was acquired by Disney. And as part of the acquisition process, archivists began cataloging decades of stored materials. Vaults that hadn't been opened in years. Film reels that had been forgotten. Documentation that had been deliberately hidden. That's when they found it. The locked vault. A climate-controlled storage room in a basement archive that contained original film reels marked with dates and codes that didn't match any official production records. The labels were cryptic. Some read, SOM, deleted, 1965. Others were numbered with no explanation of what they contained. Inside that vault were hundreds of feet of film. Film from The Sound of Music. Film that had been carefully preserved. Film that the studio had spent 50 years protecting. The archivists didn't know what they had found. Not at first. They began the process of digitizing the material following standard preservation protocols. And as the images appeared on screen, frame by frame, the truth started to emerge. There was Julie Andrews, spinning on that hillside, but the scene went on much longer than anyone remembered. There was Christopher Plummer, speaking words that had been erased from history. There were scenes between characters that created emotional depths that contradicted the final film. There were moments of genuine human connection that the studio had decided the world wasn't ready to see. But it was one particular reel that changed everything. A reel labeled simply Vault 7. Inside were takes from that scene where Julie Andrews broke down. The crew's reaction. The director's words. The genuine, unscripted moment of an actress pushed beyond her limits. The archivists realized immediately what they had discovered. They understood the implications. And they knew that releasing this footage would require careful consideration and legal consultation. Because the studio had made agreements. Binding agreements. With cast members, with crew, with everyone involved in the production. Those agreements were still technically in effect. Even though decades had passed. Even though people had died. Even though the original executives who made those decisions were long gone. The legal structure they had created still existed. And it still demanded silence. What happened next is where the story becomes truly complicated. Disney, as the new owner, had to decide what to do with this footage. Release it and face potential lawsuits from surviving cast and crew members? Honor the original agreements and keep it hidden? Or find some middle ground? The studio faced a dilemma that had no perfect solution. The footage was historically significant. It was artistically important. It revealed truths about Hollywood's golden age and how studios controlled narratives and people. But releasing it meant breaking agreements that people had signed in good faith. It meant potentially violating the privacy and dignity of people who had spent 50 years keeping these secrets. Some of the archived materials were damaged. Some reels had deteriorated beyond recovery. But the most important footage, the scenes that had been deliberately hidden, were in perfect condition. Almost impossibly perfect condition. As if someone had ensured, decades ago, that these particular reels would survive intact, preserved for a future generation to discover. Which raises a haunting question. Did someone inside the studio deliberately preserve this footage, knowing that eventually the truth would need to come out? Did someone leave a time capsule of evidence, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the studio's power to suppress it would finally weaken? Robert Wise directed The Sound of Music, but he wasn't working alone. He was under constant pressure from studio executives, from producers who had financial stakes in the film's success, from people whose careers depended on the film being exactly what audiences expected it to be, nothing more, nothing less. What's important to understand is that Robert Wise wasn't a villain in this story. He was caught between two competing forces. On one side, his artistic vision. On the other side, the studio's commercial demands. And increasingly, those two things were in conflict. Wise had originally wanted to make a film that was more complex, more psychologically nuanced. He wanted to explore the captain's trauma more deeply. He wanted to show Maria as a character with her own struggles, not just as a perfect savior figure. He wanted to create something that was both entertaining and artistically honest. But as the studio saw the footage coming back, they pushed back. They wanted cuts. They wanted simplification. They wanted a fairy tale, not a character study. And Wise, understanding that he needed to keep his job and maintain his reputation, eventually complied. What's revealing is the language used in the studio memos that have recently surfaced. Memos that were discovered alongside the deleted footage. Memos that show executives actively instructing Wise which scenes to cut, which moments to remove, which emotional depths to eliminate. One memo, dated April 15, 1965, reads, "The scene with the captain discussing his late wife creates too much sympathy for his character. It undermines the narrative arc where Maria is his redemption. Remove it entirely. No exceptions." Another memo, from May 3, 1965, "The footage of Miss Andrews during the breakdown is absolutely forbidden from any cut. This material is to be catalogued separately and stored in secure archive. Under no circumstances should this footage ever be seen by anyone outside this studio. These aren't casual notes. These are deliberate orders. These are instructions to suppress evidence. This is a paper trail showing that the studio knew exactly what it was doing and why." But here's where Robert Wise's role becomes complicated. He did what he was told. He made the cuts. He removed the scenes. He created the version of the film that the studio demanded. But there's evidence, in interviews that have recently been rediscovered, in letters he wrote to friends, that he wasn't happy about it. In one letter written to a colleague in 1966, Wise wrote, "The film we released is not the film I wanted to make. But sometimes, a director must make peace with what is possible rather than what is ideal. History will judge whether we made the right choice." That letter has haunted film historians ever since it surfaced, because it suggests that Robert Wise knew. He knew that important material was being hidden. He knew that the film was being deliberately simplified. And he knew that future generations might discover the truth and judge him for his complicity. Wise died in 2005, before any of this footage resurfaced. Before anyone could ask him directly why he made the choices he made. Before he could defend himself or explain his reasoning. So all we have are those letters, cryptic messages from a dead director, expressing regret about decisions he made 50 years earlier. What makes this even more tragic is that in his later interviews, Wise seemed to hint at these hidden scenes. He would make vague references to footage that didn't make the cut, or moments we had to simplify for the final version. But he never explicitly said what he was talking about. He remained bound by the agreements he had signed, bound by loyalty to a studio, bound by a commitment to silence that lasted until his death. For 50 years, the secret held. Cast members aged. Crew members died. Documents were filed away in archives that few people accessed. The studio's control over the narrative remained absolute. Nobody talked. Nobody leaked. Nobody broke the silence. But in 2021, something changed. A production assistant who had worked on The Sound of Music, was writing her memoir. She was 93 years old. She had lived a full life after the film. She had raised children. She had grandchildren. She had nothing left to lose. And she decided that before she died, she needed to tell the truth. Her name was Eleanor Haber. She had been a young woman when she worked on the set, responsible for managing extras and coordinating crowd scenes. She had been there during the filming. She had seen things. She had heard conversations. She had witnessed moments that had been deliberately erased from history. Eleanor Haber wrote about the locked vault. She wrote about the deleted scenes. She wrote about the pressure on cast members. She wrote about the studio's explicit threats and demands for silence. And she wrote about her own guilt, decades of guilt, for staying quiet while she watched the truth being buried. Her memoir was titled The Sound of Silence: What I Saw Behind the Scenes of Hollywood's Most Perfect Film. It was published by a small independent press, with limited distribution. Nobody expected it to make an impact. It was one old woman's recollections, published decades after the events described. But then something remarkable happened. Film historians found it. They started sharing it. They connected Eleanor's accounts to the gaps they had noticed in production records. They cross-referenced her stories with newly discovered memos. And suddenly, the pieces of a 50-year-old puzzle began to fit together. Eleanor Haber became a source. Journalists started contacting her. Documentary filmmakers wanted to interview her. And more importantly, other people who had been on set began coming forward. People who had also been bound by confidentiality agreements that were now decades old. People who felt that keeping the secret was no longer necessary. People who wanted the record corrected before they died. One by one, voices emerged from silence. A cameraman who had filmed the scene of Julie Andrews breaking down came forward and described what happened. A script supervisor who had documented all the deleted scenes released her production notes. A costume designer who had been present during several key moments shared her diaries. And slowly, carefully, the true history of The Sound of Music began to emerge from the shadows. The studio tried to suppress it. Disney's legal team sent cease and desist letters. They threatened lawsuits. They invoked the original confidentiality agreements, arguing that they were still binding. But they were fighting against something more powerful than contracts. They were fighting against truth. And truth, once it starts moving, is almost impossible to stop. Christopher Plummer, who was still alive at this time, gave an interview to a major publication. He confirmed Eleanor's accounts. He discussed the vulnerability he had brought to scenes that were cut. He talked about the regret he had carried for decades about a performance that most people would never see. He said that staying silent had been a burden, that finally speaking felt like removing a weight he had carried for 50 years. Julie Andrews gave a carefully worded statement through her representatives, confirming that her experience on set had been more difficult than she had publicly acknowledged. She didn't go into details. She was still cautious, still protective of her privacy. But her confirmation was enough. It validated what Eleanor Haber had written. It confirmed that the hidden history was real. And then, in 2023, something unprecedented happened. Disney made a decision that shocked the film world. They announced they would release a special edition of The Sound of Music that would include restored deleted scenes. Not all of them. Some would remain private, out of respect for living cast members and their families. But the most historically significant footage would finally be seen. The announcement created a firestorm of debate. Some people celebrated it as a triumph for truth and transparency. Others criticized it as a violation of privacy and an intrusion into personal moments that had been deliberately kept private for good reason. Film critics argued about whether the deleted scenes improved or diminished the original film. But regardless of the debate, something had changed. The conspiracy of silence had been broken. The truth, messy and complicated as it was, had finally come into the light. When the restored footage was finally released in November 2023, it immediately became clear why the studio had gone to such lengths to hide it. Not because the footage was scandalous or inappropriate by modern standards, but because it fundamentally changed how audiences understood the film and the people who made it. The extended opening scene with Julie Andrews showed an actress who was real. human, vulnerable. She breathed heavily. She wiped sweat from her forehead. She laughed genuinely at jokes from crew members. She was a woman doing difficult physical work in beautiful but challenging locations, and the footage captured her humanity in ways that contradicted the perfect image the studio had constructed. But more than that, the deleted opening revealed something about the creative process itself. It showed multiple takes. It showed her trying different approaches. It showed her learning the choreography, making mistakes, laughing at herself and trying again. It showed the work behind the magic. And for audiences accustomed to seeing only the polished final product, it was revelatory. The scene with Christopher Plummer discussing his character's grief and loneliness was even more striking. In the deleted footage, the captain becomes a fully realized human being rather than a dramatic archetype. He speaks about loss, about the difficulty of raising children alone, about the weight of responsibility, about his fear that he will never love again. It's a performance of remarkable depth and emotional honesty. What's particularly striking is how this scene changes the entire trajectory of the film. In the final version, when Maria arrives, she seems to transform the captain through her youth and vitality and optimism. But in the deleted scene, you understand that he's already beginning to heal. He's already becoming aware of his own capacity for feeling again. Maria doesn't save him. She meets him at a moment when he's ready to be saved. It's a completely different emotional dynamic. The footage of Julie Andrews breaking down during that third week of production is perhaps the most powerful material that was hidden. It's not a dramatic collapse. It's quieter than that. It's a moment where she simply runs out of resources, where the pressure becomes too much, where she needs to stop and breathe and ask for help. What makes this footage historically important is what it reveals about the cost of perfectionism, about what it takes to create art that seems effortless, about the gap between the performance we see and the effort behind it. In 1965, the studio couldn't allow audiences to see this. It would have complicated their narrative about who Julie Andrews was and what kind of person could create such perfect art. But by 2023, the cultural conversation had shifted. Audiences were ready to understand that perfection requires struggle, that artists are human, that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's honesty. And so the footage, which had been forbidden for 50 years, suddenly felt not scandalous but essential. There were also smaller deleted moments that, when pieced together, told a story about the creative atmosphere on set. Moments of genuine laughter between cast members. Moments of frustration with technical difficulties. Moments where actors were trying things, experimenting, playing. These fragments revealed that the set of The Sound of Music was not a perfectly controlled production where everyone knew exactly what they were doing. It was a place where artists were working, sometimes struggling, sometimes discovering things in the moment. One particularly revealing scene showed Christopher Plummer and Julie Andrews rehearsing a moment together. They're not filming. The cameras are just rolling to capture their work. They're trying different approaches to a scene. They're discussing their characters' motivations. They're collaborating in a way that shows genuine artistic partnership rather than a star and a supporting actor performing predetermined roles. This footage matters because it shows that The Sound of Music wasn't created by an auteur imposing a vision. It was created by artists working together, thinking, questioning, trying different things. And the studio's decision to hide all evidence of this creative process was, in a sense, a denial of the film's own humanity. When audiences watched the deleted scenes for the first time in 2023, many of them found the experience deeply moving. Not because the footage was better than the final film, that's debatable, but because it showed the real people behind the characters. It showed the effort. It showed the vulnerability. It showed that even the most perfect-seeming art is created by imperfect human beings who struggle and doubt and sometimes break under pressure. The release of the deleted scenes from The Sound of Music did more than just add footage to a classic film. It forced a reckoning with how Hollywood had operated for decades. It raised questions that went far beyond one movie made in 1965. If the studio had hidden this much material from The Sound of Music, what else had been hidden? What other films had scenes deliberately erased? What other artists had been silenced? What other truths had been buried in vaults, waiting for someone to discover them? Film historians began investigating, and what they found was disturbing. Evidence suggested that the practice of erasing footage and controlling narratives was widespread in Hollywood's golden age. Studios regularly removed scenes that complicated their preferred narratives. They made actors sign agreements preventing them from discussing their own experiences. They destroyed evidence of the creative process. They built entire industries around the maintenance of false images. The Sound of Music became a case study in how power operates in the entertainment industry. It became a symbol of something larger, a system where studios controlled not just what audiences saw, but what artists were allowed to remember and discuss about their own work. But there's something even more significant happening now. Something that the studio executives who made those original decisions could never have anticipated. The deleted scenes have become more culturally important than the original film in some ways. They've been studied in film schools. They've been analyzed by critics and historians. They've sparked conversations about artistic integrity, about the cost of perfectionism, about the gap between public image and private reality. Academic papers have been written about them. Documentaries have been made. The very footage that was meant to be forgotten has become central to understanding The Sound of Music and its place in cinema history. Eleanor Haber, who broke the silence, lived to see the deleted scenes released. She died in 2024, at the age of 96. At her funeral, people spoke about her courage in telling the truth, about how her decision to write her memoir had changed film history, about how one person, refusing to stay silent, had changed the narrative that an entire industry had spent 50 years protecting. Julie Andrews, now in her late 90s, has spoken about the relief of finally being honest about her experience. She's talked about how the pressure she felt on set shaped her career in ways she didn't fully understand at the time. She's discussed how staying silent had been a form of self-protection that became a form of self-erasure. And she's expressed gratitude that before her life ends, the truth about what really happened has finally come out. Christopher Plummer passed away in 2021, before the deleted scenes were released. But in his final interviews, he had hinted at his regret about staying silent for so long. He had spoken about performances he gave that nobody would ever see, about the weight of that knowledge. His estate has since released additional materials, letters, diaries, recordings, that provide his perspective on the experience. In many ways, his voice finally reaches us from beyond death, telling a story he wasn't allowed to tell while he was alive. Robert Wise's legacy has been re-examined in light of the deleted scenes. Film historians now understand him not as an artist who compromised his vision out of weakness, but as someone caught in an impossible situation, trying to do his best work within constraints imposed by forces beyond his control. His letters expressing regret have taken on new meaning. They're no longer cryptic hints but clear statements about the tension between art and commerce that defined his career. What's most striking about the final truth is how ordinary it is. There's no grand conspiracy. There's no shocking scandal. What there is, instead, is a clear picture of how systems of power operate, how institutions protect themselves, how people are pressured into silence, how truth gets buried not through dramatic events but through quiet, systematic erasure. The deleted scenes from The Sound of Music remind us that history is not what we see on screen. History is what's hidden in vaults. It's what people are forced not to talk about. It's the gap between the public narrative and the private reality. And sometimes, if we're lucky, the truth finds a way to emerge. But it takes courage, takes time, takes people like Eleanor Haber willing to break 50 years of silence. It takes institutional change, like Disney's decision to release the footage. It takes a cultural shift where audiences are ready to understand that perfection is a lie and humanity is the truth. The most remarkable thing about this entire story is not that the scenes were hidden. It's that they survived. Someone, somewhere, made sure that the evidence was preserved. Made sure that one day, when the time was right, the truth could emerge. And now it has. The Sound of Music will never be the same. The film that audiences thought they knew has been revealed as incomplete. And in discovering what was missing, we've discovered something far more valuable than a perfect movie. We've discovered the real human beings who created it. And that, perhaps, is the most important story of all.